Everyone sees my screen, I hope.
Yes.
Yes, so welcome everyone. We really appreciate that you're all here tonight, and I think it's important that we meet, not for the world, a little bit for the world, but also for ourselves, because I think we've seen over the past weeks again that the systemic crises we face are really intensifying, and rivers play an important role in them, both in climate, biodiversity crisis, but also in underlying causes of poverty, social tension, economic inequality. And we are seeing that societies and especially governments are struggling to deal with this. That's why activism and bottom-up movements are really needed, as they have been in many important phases in human history, I think, be it to show disapproval on the ground, to reconnect people, or to be pioneers of more sustainable solutions. But I think as urgent as the situation is, and as much as it creates certain panic, we cannot rush into this, because it doesn't help if we are all shooting stars, burning brightly and quickly. Instead, I think we need to hold ourselves and our activism to the same standards that we want to bring to societies, which I think is kindness and respect, but also long-term thinking and regeneration. So we cannot practice activism that erodes our own base over time. And if you take the example of this campfire that you see from 2 months ago at the Neretva in Bosnia, to keep burning, this campfire needs a positive energy balance over time. It must constantly be fed with fuel and oxygen. And I think the same principle, the same metaphor holds true for our engagements. And our energy is also burned by different sources, by the fact that a lot of our work is volunteer-based. We need to balance it, juggle it with other priorities. We see a lot of destruction. We are fighting systemic exploitation. As activists, the result of our work is often not immediately apparent. And also as researchers, our work can seem very disconnected from the ecosystem that we actually try to protect. But we also have powerful fuel on the other hand. I think a lot of us have a close connection to nature, to wild rivers, to forests. We have a lot of curiosity. We have good strategies. We know successful initiatives that we can learn from. And above all, and I think that's why I'm so happy to have you here, is that we hopefully have a good support system. Because I think we all need a community from which we can learn, where we can feel heard, where we can share our vulnerability, but also feel safe to disagree. And this is basically why we are meeting in this virtual space today, to all replenish our energy reserves and to fuel our respective fires, because I think we're all basically the fire keepers, protecting the flame, and we want to keep it burning for a long time. We want to sustain it and invite a lot of new people into the circle around the fire who can enjoy the warm glow of it, like we did in this photo 2 months ago at the Students for Rivers camp. So I think with this picture, I want to just introduce you to this evening. And with this, I go on to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Professor Gabriel Singer from the University of Innsbruck. He's a long-time advocate for protection of river ecosystems. He's a professor of aquatic biochemistry in Innsbruck, and he's also a member of the Coalition of Scientists for Balkan Rivers. And over the past years, he was strongly involved with the various science weeks that you can see here at the Neretva in 2022 and 2023, this year at the Vjosa in Albania, and also at the Sarantapros in Greece. And I think we're all very happy to have Gabriel here. Thank you for joining us, and we're really excited to hear your insights. So I will stop sharing my screen.
You stop and I will try to start sharing. Wait a minute. You can see something?
It's loading. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for having me invited for today, guys. I actually have to start with an apology because I suppose there will be a lot of people here today that actually were expecting me on the Neretva just 2 months ago. And I promised to be there like maybe 5 times. And then very close to actually getting into my car and going there, I had to cancel my participation. So maybe I can make up a little bit of this with talking to you today. So I like the introduction. No, you said a long-time advocate. This makes me an old man, no? Obviously. Let's see if I can give you some. I don't know if this is really, like even old men just learn by doing things, no? And it's all about like maybe collecting experiences. I like the idea that we just have to round up in the campfire and then maybe things happen by themselves in a way, no? Okay, I start with a picture that some of you may know. This is a picture from the Neretva, and in fact, it's where the Ljuta, the tributary just downstream of where the Ulok Dam now is, joins the Neretva. I fear that this spot is not that beautiful anymore, simply because the last pictures I've seen from the Neretva are not that nice and blue. I don't know how things have changed. They started to actually fill Ulok Dam, so things have changed a bit. But I really like this picture. It's been made from a drone by Josh, in fact, Josh Lim, who is with us on a lot of science weeks. And I will try to use it as a background to illustrate this idea, no, that I come to you as a scientist in a way. And I do feel like an advocate for river systems. And there's a story behind this. Because when you belong to the older guys, maybe there was a time when being an advocate was not necessarily something that was easy to do when you also wanted to be a scientist, right? So I'm talking to you as a scientist that also understands himself as an advocate, and I will try to get across that probably the more promising ways to actually do both is to form a network, meet people, no, have a campfire, basically. So the science, no, I want to talk a little bit about the science because it's fascinating, no, and it's what actually makes me burn for rivers, and it's also where I can take some of the motivation that Sam said is needed, some of the energy that's needed, and I take some of that energy from kayaking, but I also take a lot of that energy from trying to understand the complexities of natural ecosystems. And there's a lot to learn. And as a scientist, I really think that's just truly fascinating. No? I like to understand things. I like to pose questions. I like it when it gets complicated, right? And in the rivers, a lot of things are just driven by basically flow. And so what I study a lot is flowing materials, basically. So this can be organic material like those leaves, or it's the brown stuff that sometimes moves with water. And any of this, like this flow of materials in rivers always is not just the downstream transport, it's also the processing. It's the fact that something happens with this material while it's transported downstream. Here's a small picture actually where we put this already into the context of a river network. You can see my mouse, I hope, no? Yes, you can, I think. Where we investigated basically paired catchments. So these are two catchments that are neighboring each other, and they have very different land cover. And this difference in land cover actually means, you can see this sketch here too. This difference in land cover means that these two tributaries actually receive very different organic material, very different resources from the catchment, from the terrestrial surrounding. And then these resources are transported downstream, but they're also processed as they're transported. And this is shown by this spiral. And then they mix at a confluence and create a new resource situation, right? And new resource situation means it's an entirely new environment for microbes and invertebrates, for instance, that actually need this organic material as their energy, to build a food web and to live. And this spiral, right, is what I'm mostly interested in, because sometimes this spiral actually is pretty long. There's not much happening other than transport. And sometimes this spiral gets like pushed together. And then it actually shows there's a lot of stuff happening to the material while it's in transport. And conceptually, what we then do is we differentiate between a river that's a passive pipe, where things are transported, and a river that actually behaves like an active reactor, where things are processed as they go, right? Flow in rivers, of course, is not just affecting our resources, but it also drives a lot of biodiversity. And I want to spend 2 slides on this biodiversity problem. Some of you may know a few things, but I'd like to pull them together as the main key facts. No? So if you happen to work in rivers, there was a point maybe when you realized that these systems actually are, you think about their spatial footprint on the planet, they're not very large. No, they don't make up a big percentage of the area of the planet, basically. But if you count species that you can find in freshwater, so these graphs on the left actually include lakes and rivers, but most of the diversity here is at home in rivers. If you count species and then you just express what we call a species density, so this would be a richness of species by the number of species by area, then the freshwater environments actually are topping terrestrial systems, so even rainforests and marine systems, right? And in the upper graph, you can see that the freshwater systems actually have about 11% of the known animal biodiversity, and their spatial area of the planet is less than 1%. So they hold an over proportional component of the Earth's biodiversity. And a lot of it is connected to rivers, as I said, and there are 2 main reasons for why rivers are so good in providing a home to biodiversity. One is that in any river, you have strong gradients and habitat properties, and these habitats are connected in a very specific way. So if you just go from like a small river to a small stream, like a source spring, to like a big river, there are a lot of different environmental habitats, environmentally different habitats that you can find there. They're all nicely connected, right? But each of these river stretches provides for a specific community, just thinking about the habitat conditions. And the second most important fact that drives this biodiversity is the fact that rivers actually are, in a spatial sense, really complex because they form these networks, right? They're not islands, and they're not lakes, they're not like massive bodies of water where there's a lot of organisms moving in and out and so on. They have a very peculiar shape. They form these dendritic networks where a lot of systems are connected, but in fact, they're really far from each other. So for instance, if you're living in a place like here, this could be a very small spring stream, and it's a very similar habitat to maybe this place here, but it's really far to get there. Maybe you can fly, but in fact, most organisms will be limited to actually moving along the river, and then this is a really long distance, right? So these 2 things, the fact that rivers form this network structure, and second, that they have this huge habitat diversity, is what makes biodiversity. So this is what one of my favorite rivers. I happen to bring students there on a regular basis, and I also did research there. These are pictures from the Vjosa River, and it's one river, right? But here just different pictures along about maybe 280 kilometers of river, where you move from something like a dry tributary upstream to something like this braided river section in a further downstream part. So why is biodiversity and how is it supported in this structure? We, as ecologists, know we differentiate 2 different mechanisms. And one is what we refer to as niche-based, and this is what most of us will know. This is the plain idea that a specific species has specific requirements to its habitat, right? And you will find it at places where these habitats, or where the conditions that are needed, the requirements are fulfilled, basically. So you can think of this, again, this is again a Vjosa River network here, basically. This may be a different habitat than this, so you may find a different community here just because they need different habitats. But there's a second mechanism, and that's actually niche independent. And niche independent here means basically you may find organisms at places not necessarily because they fit there in terms of their requirements, right? But to some extent, just because of chance. And this chance is because all these places in rivers happen to be disturbed quite often. We all know that some of the smaller tributaries can fall dry. We know floods actually have a great impact in smaller rivers, not so much a less strong impact in the bigger rivers. So these systems are disturbed, meaning from time to time there are natural extinctions happening, right? So extinction not meaning a global extinction meaning there's a flood passing through this place, and then maybe a few species or the entire community gets wiped out of this place. And then this place needs to be recolonized, and this is what these green arrows should show you. And this recolonization is, again, a slow process because you either have to fly across a mountain or you have to actually swim through an awful long part of the river network to actually reach this place again. Now, if you take these things together, this means that some of these habitats actually will be in what we call a successional state. They're not in a climax state. They're in some sort of recolonization state, right? And since disturbance never hits the same, all these places at the same time, these habitats can actually be in different states of recolonization, different successional states. And this means they may have different communities, different species living there, not because they have different environmental conditions, but simply because they have different histories of disturbance and succession, right? And this is why we call this a neutral mechanism, because it's really just connected to the fact that there's disturbance, extinction, recolonization, and these processes are dynamic over time. And therefore, they create diversity at the scale of the whole river network. So this diversity at the scale of the whole river network very often is then expressed in the form of a beta diversity. And it's basically a diversity component that's hidden, right, in the differentiation between different communities. And that's pretty important. So you may have a lot of species at any of these single locations, but there is a component of biodiversity between these locations. Simply the fact that maybe 3 species are here and there's another 3 species here, but only one of them is shared, right? So this creates more than 3 species in total, again, already, and this is the beta component. And this beta diversity component is really large in rivers. It's much larger than in other systems. And on top of this, you can imagine now what counts in rivers in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of resources that are basically transported and processing through this river is always how these individual pieces in the river network, these individual segments, these tributaries are connected. And how they're connected depends again on basically whether you build a dam, whether a section falls dry, whether you have a flood, when all of a sudden the water flows much faster. So this connectivity is a big issue. And I think it's quite obvious that if you build a dam, you change that connectivity. Here's an example of a moving organism that I'd like to present. Some of you may know it. It's Prosopistoma. It's a little mayfly living on the Vjosa, and it's a species that's close to extinction. We only know it from 3 rivers in Europe, and it has once been widespread in large rivers in Europe, and now we only find it somewhere in Russia, on the Volga, in fact, on the Vjosa, and then in a stream in Spain. So this is what I mean with like moving. For some of these organisms, moving may actually be really difficult, right? Let me give you a bit more about research, because I want to get across that I'm actually a scientist, right? This should be about science and activism, so I need to at least load a little bit of science in you. I'm staying in the Vjosa, and here I'm showing you some of this resource transport, if you so want. The picture here doesn't really show organic material and nutrients, but it shows fine sediment. And this is the confluence of the Aos that comes here from Greece and the river Sarandaparos that comes here from the left. And you can see the 2 rivers have massively different water color. And that's because the Sarandaparos brings far more fine sediment, simply because it has a very different geology in its catchment. So this tells you quite a lot about it, no? And this is actually this is a variance partitioning. So this is a statistical method basically that tries to get a main habitat feature, which is the in-stream light, which is nothing else than basically how turbid the river is. And when you actually sample at many, many places in this river network, you can identify geology in the catchment as a main driver of this turbidity, but you can also find the way how the river is connected, how the river network is connected, its topology, as having a strong influence on turbidity, right? So it's not just what's the geology, what's the land use, what's the land cover, which resources do people throw in the river, right? Or which pollution they throw in the river. It's also about how how these different parts of the river are connected. And this is going to shape, in this case, turbidity or the light conditions in the stream as a main environmental factor. We also studied this there. I like to bring these examples because they're showing you how much fun science can be. This is Jess. She's actually a member of River Collective, active ever since, from the very beginning. And she is kayaking down the Vjosa River here with a turbidity sensor mounted on her kayak and collecting turbidity data basically over almost like 200 kilometers down to the sea over maybe 3 or 4 days. And we tried to make sense of this turbidity data, connecting it basically to the topology of the river network, but also identifying not just different tributaries, but also sources and sinks within the system. So if you have a very deep area where water is flowing slowly, then actually that's a place where fine sediment can actually deposit at low water, and then it later may be remobilized, right? This is what makes me also recharge my batteries, no? Because Sam mentioned we need to make sure that there's enough energy for our advocacy, right? Last slide for science, almost the last slide. I think here I can't go much into detail. This is actually showing you biodiversity patterns on the Vjosa River. This is molecular biological data. It's sequencing data from periphyton. Periphyton are algae living in biofilm. And I'm not going to explain these graphs here. I'm basically just telling you that these patterns of biodiversity here, they actually have an influence, an impact on primary production, which in this case is the main function, right? This is a super nice story, and it's been published just a month ago. Yeah, just a month ago, you can actually download it, or I can send it to you if you want. So main line here, right, is rivers are super nice and complicated, no? And specifically when you start to think about them at the scale of an entire river network. And I think this is the scale where also we should be thinking of rivers when we advocate for them. Because quite obviously, if you start building a dam, you fragment a river. So you actually create an impact at that landscape scale and not just locally, right? River networks have a really weird spatial structure, no? This dendritic network, the fact that that water flows through this network in an asymmetric fashion, this creates a very complex physical template in which all this biodiversity and all these natural processes actually happen. So we like to call rivers or river networks a meta ecosystem, and organisms living there would be then a meta community. And the idea is that basically these are sets, right, of local communities that exchange and local ecosystems that exchange species and materials. So if I want to build a river, right, if I were tasked to do this either in the computer or in the lab, I would say I need a network first, right? And this is something that actually I think for maybe half a century, river ecologists were not thinking about. They said, I have 100 meters of river and it has an inflow and an outflow, and that's the river ecosystems I work at. Or they tried to follow gradients from source to sea, somehow assuming that rivers magically grow in size, okay? I want to differentiate the landscape. I want the fact that geology is not the same everywhere. Land cover is different, right? I want resources to flow through the system, and I want a few bucks, right? And I want a flow regime that is actually dynamic. So all of this is tied to flow, right? And if flow ceases to happen because we do this sort of stuff, this is actually the Ulok construction site, I think 2 years ago, probably, right? Then river ceases to flow. And then what happens is, and that's my last example for a study, what happens is that here is an illustration of greenhouse gases. When you start to build a dam, you hold water back. It's not flowing anymore. You create oxygen deficits. And then what happens is that you actually create a lot more greenhouse gases than you had in the beginning. And this is an example from another study that we did with students a couple years ago on the first Neretva Science Week, where we measured greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and methane. And we could identify different controls on these greenhouse gases. And one of the nicest things was that there was a real hotspot of methane production in a very quiet pool. And it's unfortunate, but pretty sure that the new reservoir at Ulok will probably become the new hotspot of methane production in the system. This is a story that's been published as part of the Science Week efforts that we have done. So it can be looked up. Maybe let's move away from science for now. And I'm giving you another picture of the same construction site. This is maybe about a year ago, because now the dam is done and the reservoir is flooded. And I would like to ask you a little bit more what you think about this now. And it's not just about the science and okay, understanding that this actually changes ecology. I want to get a little bit deeper. I want to actually touch your emotions. This is a no-flow crisis, and I want to get to the emotional parts of it. I want to know how you react, right? And I can see basically a few different reactions when a landscape like this one above changes to this, right? You can give a shit or not, right? And then the question is a bit, what's your strategy, how to cope with this? And here's a few pieces of advice and a few different strategies, okay? And I give this to you in the sense of a few books. The first one is an all-time classic of ecological sabotage, okay? Monkey wrenching is an illegal activity, but it's basically trying to sabotage a construction site like the one we see here. Read it, it's real fun, okay? The second piece, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, is written from somebody in the climate movement. Andreas Malm is actually a climate scientist, and he advocates here, not necessarily, he doesn't explain to you how to blow up a pipeline, but he actually explains to you the necessity of activism and why we should consider blowing up a pipeline rather than how to do it. The how to do is something you learn when you read the monkey wrenching effect. Okay, maybe that's not too serious for you. You can also read the Letters to a Young Scientist from Edward Wilson, one of the greatest evolutionary ecologists that you can think of. I have not actually made it through the whole book because in one of the first chapters, he suggests that there shouldn't be any vacation for scientists because all they need is field trips. I find that a bit difficult, no, to keep me going without vacation. But it's true science, okay? And maybe the last one is coming from applied industry. This would be the GHG Greenhouse Gas Measurement Guidelines for Freshwater Reservoirs, and it's published by the Hydropower Association. So this is basically a guideline how to design and run reservoirs to not let them emit too much greenhouse gases. And I think of these books as actually describing a nice gradient, no? You can be a monkey wrencher, you can sort of become an activist, you can become an advocating and very informed steward for an ecosystem. You can be a scientist that doesn't really worry so much about ecosystems other than their fascination in a way, right? I like to call these people the ivory tower scientists, right? And maybe you're an industry researcher, right? And I think this is really a question of personal attitude, but it's a bit more because it's also a gradient of, again, different niches, right? Some of us are actually monkey wrenches maybe, and some of us are actually working for industry. And we all probably have the same aim. And we work together efficiently because we actually occupy a different niche on this gradient. And I think that's something important to understand when you think about how can we link science to activism, right? It's not necessarily meaning you should become an activist as a scientist. It's rather trying to identify the place on this continuum, on this gradient, where you can contribute best to conserving an ecosystem, okay? So I'm a professor, meanwhile. I can probably start to monkey wrench, but maybe it's not the most efficient position I can take, right? This is what I would like to get across. So don't look down on people that work for industry and try to run reservoirs in a meaningful way. They also do a good job, right? And maybe also don't look down on monkey wrenches because I also think they do a good job, but I have a specific job in this, right? And this specific job is something that I actually illustrated with this lovely triangle in the beginning. This idea of like, I'm a scientist that can advocate, and I try to advocate efficiently by actually forming a network. And if students ask me what I think of what they should become in the 21st century, if they want to become good ecologists, then I think they should become active stewards of ecosystems, right? And stewards of ecosystems are informed, right? They know how these ecosystems work, but then they actually take a position. They put a stake in the ground fighting for a specific ecosystem, right? And I think the most important thing in this is step out of this comfort zone of the scientist that is worried about losing credibility. When you talk to like a journalist or an NGO person, don't worry about this because you actually are the expert compared to many others. Step out of there and rather take responsibility. Okay, so these are, I think, for me, very different things. One is being worried about credibility as a scientist, and the other thing is take responsibility because knowing that you are the expert for a particular problem, a particular question, a particular system. So you got to actually tell something about it, right? So here's again the threat we need to actually tackle. This is our challenge, right? And it's not just a single dam at Ulok, it's actually a couple thousand. And here I just showed them on the Balkan. And this is basically the map that most of you know, more than 3,000 hydropower plants planned or under construction in a place where hydromorphology is in a really good state. But we have the same problem anywhere in the world, okay? So hydropower development is still surging pretty much everywhere, but there are places like here where there's a lot of rivers that are under threat. So how do we do this? One thing, and this is what I can show you today, is this idea of like actually coming up with a network of scientists. And the network actually has a name meanwhile. It's called Scientists for Balkan Rivers. And its main event is the Science Week. From time to time, we actually managed to do a webinar similar to what we do today. There's some sort of regular meetups, but the Science Weeks are the core activity, okay? And I think Science Weeks are where exactly this triangle comes to life, where you can work as a scientist and you can foster your reputation as a scientist, you can publish, but you can also advocate. And this advocation, this advocacy means getting used to exposing yourself to cameras, to interviews. It's kind of like an outreach activity 2.0. It's a bit more than what classical university wants you to do when they talk about public outreach. And then the networking component is build capacity, right? Network with people from other countries, teach and train students. And in the end, this is eventually just means to party, right? Here's a picture that brings this to life, really. You can see Uli Eichelmann from Riverwatch giving an interview to CNN. These are the journalists that came with us from CNN. He explains to them why the Neretva is so important. And Kurt Pinter here prepares to sample eDNA in the Neretva in the background, right? So these are the things that we like to combine in here. The blueprint for this Science Week actually was the first Vjosa Science Week in 2018. And the results of this were published in a little booklet here. You can see up here, this you can actually find on the internet. And the results were also published or made public to the public media, for instance, by doing a press conference here on the gravel bed of the Vjosa River, okay? And it's been the triangle in action, and it was really contributing to the creation of this national park. So it's something that we really try to like repeat in a way, right? If by any means possible. The two Neretva Science Weeks actually took place in 22 and 23. It's a little tricky to go there again with a Science Week because, well, interest of people kind of like lowers a little bit when you go to the same place too often, even though, of course, you could stay years there and just do research. We brought a lot of people. It's always been more than 50 students and scientists from a lot of different countries studying all sorts of stuff from
Oh, Hope is back soon.
So close to the end.
Yeah, Sam, if you don't mind, I would maybe otherwise quickly use 30 seconds until he comes back, hopefully. I just quickly will send a message in the chat. So maybe to the people that don't know me yet, I'm Franzi. I'm also part of the River Collective for a couple of years now. And together with two others, we have created the survey and might already have annoyed you a bit with some messages. But in case you didn't fill it in yet and participated in one of the Students for Rivers camps, it would be super nice to fill in this survey. Thank you.
Francie, I think you saved him from a too long speech from you. It's fine. If you get bored, you follow this survey. It's
No,
important.
yeah, feel free to continue, Gabriel.
No, I think it's good because this is what I'm talking about. No, it's like trying to actually create this linkage, no, and what the science and where the science and activism meets anyway, no. So here are just a few numbers, no, like what we actually try to contribute, and then I think there's two really big things of like this is why we do this for. One is basically public attention, because in the end, to be honest, guys, maybe 50% of what we do is not finding a rare species because we know that these species are there. It's cool, right? But 50% is just being there and using scientists to shine a spotlight on a specific system and then try to actually create media attention by doing so. And this actually has worked, at least on Neretva, really nicely with a lot of like public media attention in various magazines and websites and so on.
You're not sharing your slides anymore.
Oh, that's bad. How did that happen, guys? Franz, you kicked out my presentation. Wait. Are we back again?
Yes, and you were also frozen for like 3 minutes. Maybe
For 3 minutes?
Maybe there was a little confusion. That's why Franzi stepped in to entertain
I'm not
us.
going to go back. I don't know. What was the last thing I said, guys? Just, I'm not going to repeat, but maybe that I can find a...
The CNN.
The CNN story. Okay, that's easy. Okay, so public media attention, okay, is one thing we want to create, but at the same time we want to make sure that what we do, it's a bit like what Sam said in the beginning, no, making sure that our energy is burning nicely. We have to actually just take care of our CVs, no, and this means we actually need to publish. Here, for instance, is a book with the final results. You can actually find this in the internet too. There will also be a similar book. This is a disciplinary journal, right? So here we actually target peers, ecologists, right? Whereas in these two preliminary reports, they're written in a much simpler way. They have a lot more illustration. They target the public audience. So you see, we do a lot of things at the same time, right? Okay. I think one thing that I really hopefully try to get across is that rivers are damn fascinating, right? And our approach is to keep them free flowing, right? I have not spent a single word on restoration or dam removal, okay? And the reason for this is that my understanding is that protecting an intact place is much more important than actually restoring it. And I'd like to show this curve here that links an ecosystem state like biodiversity or ecosystem integrity with a pressure. And it shows a phenomenon called hysteresis, where a sort of development has a certain trajectory if you go one way, but if you want to revert this development, you have to go back another way, okay? So the way you interpret this is basically an intact system is going to be somewhere here. And when you add pressure, it will develop this way until pressure is eventually too high, and then it fails. It moves into a different alternative state. And then it's the degraded state here. The way back would be restoration. And the problem we have with restoration is that very often we start to remove pressure, and then we are at this point, and we think now it would be time for this switch back. But the switch back isn't happening. We have to keep removing pressure, and then eventually we find this switch back, okay? And this thing that, in fact, the path of degradation is different from the path of restoration. This is called hysteresis. And it's, for me, the main argument why intact ecosystems need to be protected. okay, degraded ecosystems also need to be restored, and we are entering the age of restoration, no matter what comes, right? But we should not restore at the price of, at the same time, giving up other places. Here's a form again if you want to become a member of the Balkan River, the scientist group. Last thing, because I said rivers and biodiversity and blah, blah, blah. And yes, we have these really big crises. Biodiversity is dropping like crazy. So we need to protect systems and we need to restore. But isn't there this really big but? We also have climate change. And this is a really big problem. And this is why people tell us that we need all those hydropower plants, okay? So here I have an answer that may be a bit complicated, but you're a scientist, right? So I think I can get this across. So these are two crises that we have to tackle at the same time, right? One is we lose biodiversity at a rate that is just insane. And at the same time, we heat the climate at probably an equally insane rate, right? So we have two challenges and we need to tackle them at the same time. These two challenges are actually connected to each other. And the first graph here just shows you this, what I call the problem triangle. Here are humans, and here's climate change. Humans drive climate change, right? So they affect the climate, but this has a feedback. We don't like it when sea levels rise. It's not good for us. We don't like it when heat waves strike Europe. It's not good for us. People die, right? So there's a negative feedback here right away. We also destroy habitat, so we lose biodiversity, and there's a negative feedback here too, right? Because we lose information, we lose the potential to invent medicine, we lose productivity of agricultural systems. There's negative feedbacks here as well. And then dramatically, there's a really negative feedback too from climate change to biodiversity. Climate change has meanwhile increased to top position for biodiversity loss, right? So climate change is the primary driver of biodiversity. So how do we tackle this? Here's what I think we do at the moment most of the time. Strategy number one. And strategy number one says, let's stop climate change at all costs. And I say at all costs, maybe except the economic costs, because what we try to do is basically run what's called a green economy. We try to make business with the fact that we tackle climate change. And I think this strategy is really mainly economically informed, but it's also unrealistic, right? In this strategy, we give, sorry to say, we give a shit about biodiversity loss. This problem is not addressed, okay? By doing so, we hope to actually decrease climate change, and then maybe also this area is going to be smaller, okay? It's pretty unrealistic because we are not in a position anymore where we can stop climate change. In fact, we are in the middle of like an intermediate scenario of development. Strategy number two is what I call an ecologically informed and a bit more realistic strategy. And this is maybe we can't really do so much about climate change anymore. We can decelerate it, but we can't stop it anymore. So what we need to worry about is we need to adapt to climate change. And in order to adapt, what we need is biodiversity because it's helping us to adapt to new climates. If we lose our tree diversity in Central Europe, we will not be able to cope with the vegetation that has to move across the continent. This is as simple as it is. So there's a new arrow here that says, guys, if we keep biodiversity, it's going to help us adapt to climate change. And this is what I mean with tackling both challenges at the same time, right? Okay, I talked way too long. I just want to say thanks to the people that actually did the science with me, the people that did the kayaking and speak up with me and all the advocacy, and the people that network with me. And I think now Sam has plans to actually discuss some of the issues that I raised.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for this talk. And first, I just want to open the floor for any immediate questions to Gabriel for a short Q&A before Ben will take over and explain something. But are there any questions that go to Gabriel directly now? Doesn't seem to be the case.
It was too confusing.
We still have time to discuss. Lily is having a hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriel, for this talk. I think I can speak on all participants' behalf for that. I had actually a question about the methane reservoirs being produced by the hydropower reservoirs. Is it like a spike in methane until most of organic matter is decomposed, or is it like, is that the state these reservoirs will be in, like anoxic zones forever? Forever and ever is maybe a bit long, but
yeah,
could you say something about that?
It's both, in fact, right? It's the fact that you actually flood a landscape with a lot of biomass, with soil and maybe vegetation. It matters quite a bit if you actually remove the forest before you flood a landscape, for instance. So all this organic material is eventually going to be respired and turns up in the atmosphere as CO2 and potentially also as methane. But you also have to understand the reservoir is basically like a reactor, right? That actually receives a lot of stuff from upstream and creates environmental conditions, a stratified water body, and a deep water release through turbines that actually are very conducive to methane emissions. So it's both, right? It's flooding the landscape and digesting this organic material, and at the same time, kind of like running a system forever, in fact, right, that keeps producing greenhouse gases. And here the mechanisms are a bit more complicated, but it's really the fact that there's food, resources, organic material coming in all the time, having a stratified water body like a lake, and usually taking deep water that gets released through the turbines, and this creates a lot of methane that can reach the atmosphere. I hope this makes it clear. It's quite an interesting fact.
Yes, it is clear. Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, then I ask Gabriel to stop sharing the screen.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think you can just take over.
Yeah, now I can.
Until I find the button.
No.
We cannot find it. Where is it?
So now I'm handing over to Ben, who is giving a little.
Sorry, I think there are some more hands.
Some more hands?
Waiting, I think.
There are some more hands.
Luis and Liz. I
Oh, yeah.
think.
Yes, questions for it.
Liz, go ahead. You're the only hand I see right now.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. So you said something about not being afraid of losing your credibility as scientists, but sometimes activists also weigh something from you, in fact, a certain position or response, and sometimes you know that what you recommend might not align to what activists, I guess, we're hoping for, and there is also the risk to lose. Sorry for the noise. I'm in a cafe. So, but there is also the risk to lose their credibility. So how do you position yourself when you know that maybe what you will going to say will not be that well received? Or have you ever been in that position? Thank you.
So I'm not sure if I understood it completely, but I think it was about losing credibility towards activists because I may not actually say what they expected.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, it may actually happen, yes. Honestly, I think this actually happens when activists, if I actually want to just put them in one big one big box, is sometimes there are expectations, I don't know how to word this, that are very like, campaign-like, I would say, okay? So I recently had a case where like environmental NGOs, I don't need to name them, but they came up with like a press release idea, and it was meant to be like a common press release where I was also part of it. But the language that was used was really not the language that I feel familiar with and I feel safe with, okay? And then I said, like, this is okay, guys, but then this cannot be, this is then campaign language in a way, right? So your expectation is that I carry this with you, but this is not possible for me, right? I need a more neutral language, right? I need a language that's closer to facts rather than emotional words, if you want, right? I don't know if this, so maybe the answer here is a bit The problem, in my opinion, rests with expectations from the other side that are probably wrong, right? And it's getting, maybe it's also about this gradient again, no? Like understanding that we use different language. And also having a bit of respect for the different niches on this gradient that we occupy. Does this make any sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So I think it's time. It's what I do is basically trying to stand my ground. Okay, saying, okay, I'm a scientist and this is the language I use. I am a professional skeptic, if you want. I can withdraw to like textbook knowledge and say this and this, right? And mostly this is actually pretty okay. Huh? I mean, I can say, look, guys, biodiversity loss is dramatic. Any new dam is shit. Is that good enough? I guess so, right? Somebody said there was another question. I don't have overview of who. Louise.
Yes, thanks. My question was coming from the fact that you connected climate change with activism against hydropower and stewardship for rivers. I think it's really interesting. I'm studying more the policy side, and I was quite interested in the two strategies that you mentioned, but I was curious about not only the green economy idea and the adaptation idea, but also alternatives to that, because I think it's also part of our activism, at least when I'm turning more to social scientists. Do you have any opinions on that? Because you've been in that field for quite some time now, and yeah, I'm trying to find my grounds. There's many different ways to envision the future right now that are emerging around that, around water and how we should live with water, and also adapt to climate change, more like in a systematic way, in system levels, in terms of like transforming the society that we live in. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm not sure if I got the question right, but what I take from this is you haven't said anything about, you know, the needed societal transformation. But yes, I fully agree. I mean, this whole green economy idea is really, in my opinion, not just trying to keep living the way and running the same economy we did, right? Just with a different label. I guess this transformation that's needed, I'm not sure if this is an answer in a way, no? But this idea of like tackling these two challenges at the same time, I mean, these are really only two, guys. There's so many, you know? And they're tied to like social injustice all the time. So if you think of this as like maybe a third corner, I like triangles. If you make squares, it gets too many problems at once. So you were asking about societal transformation with regard to water.
Yeah, or just maybe alternative views that you have seen that you find inspiring or promising and somewhere fertile for, yeah, some food for thought in that regards, because there is a lot out there. Obviously, the green economy is not an answer, but also adaptation and mitigation is not enough to face climate change and yeah, I mean the rising inequalities and yeah, all the environmental impacts that the system still will create, I think. So what has inspired you in that regards? But maybe it's a big question for now.
For now, I have to admit that it's a bit of a too big question. I mean, it's cool that you brought in the social dimension, no? Like it's something that I obviously don't. I mean, I haven't put it in as like two possible scenarios of addressing these issues. I think the plain answer for now is no. I can't inspire you with a really good example of how things could work.
No worries. Thank you for sharing and trying.
But thank you for bringing back in the social dimensions, in fact.
Yeah, I will jump in here. No, thank you very much for the presentation. Really inspiring. I saw it at the, I think I've seen you give it before, and so I wanted to make sure that this group could see this. I think it's really important. And thanks for the good questions. So I'm going to deliver a couple of announcements, and then we do have breakout rooms, but maybe we don't want to use them to the full extent, but it would be nice if you kind of hear us out and maybe you would like to use them. So the first announcement is regarding the camp, the river camp for 2025. I think a lot of people were really interested in seeing what was happening, and I think the River Collective and the kind of organizing team had a lot of time to think about this. The focus this year is going to be on the sustainability of the River Collective and kind of long-term